Carlson. I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's webinar. I'm a partner and a co-founder of Propellers. I'm very happy to be delivering this webinar with Steve Brickman. We have a great turnout for today's session on 5 considerations for enterprise mobile app user experience. And this is a great topic. You know, we work with a lot of organizations, and many of those organizations tend to focus on some of the technical considerations of building applications and delivering and securing these types of use cases. But honestly, very few focus on some of the more, the softer and sometimes more important user experience of enterprise mobile apps. Also great to see so many current clients and prospects on the call. So hello to Len, Mike, and Scott. Great to see you guys on the call today. I also wanted to welcome our speaker, Steve Brickman. Steve, nice to have you here today.
Thanks, Eric. Nice to be here.
And before we get going, a couple housekeeping issues. First of all, there is a Q&A panel in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx window, and there you can use that to ask some questions to Steve throughout the presentation. I'm going to try to pull those together, and either I'll interrupt him or I'll be kind and wait to the end of the webinar. Also, as always, these recordings are available on our website at www.propellers.com, as well as the slides will be available for you to download after this webinar is complete. Just wanted to do 60 seconds on Propellers. We create mobile strategies and world-class applications for the enterprise. 100% of our focus is on mobile for the enterprise. It's all that we do. A lot of that, some of that is customer-facing, but more importantly, we feel is on some of the higher value use cases for employees, partners, distributors, etc. We've got over a 15-year track record in providing enterprise-level strategy to Fortune 500 clients, and we help build strategies around technology use, but specifically in taking advantage of disruptive technologies and how they impact the business. For the last 6, actually going on 7 years now, we've been working exclusively in mobile, both in terms of single-use embedded devices and also really riding the wave of consumer mobile devices. We try to drive valuable use cases to employees and customers and partners for our clients. We're based in San Jose, but we've got consultants across North America, and many of our engagements include a large global reach, and you can see some of our clients listed below. A few things on what we do. We really offer 3 really large categories of services. The first area is we do a lot of mobile strategy services for our clients. These are delivered as fast-paced workshop engagements, sometimes as quickly as a single week. We really built our services and our kickstarts around specific challenges we see repeatedly in discussions with our prospects. And so these kickstarts are really starting points for those conversations. They're fixed time, fixed price, short duration types of things, and aligned to where our clients typically are. You can see some of those, such as building a mobile application portfolio, either within a business unit or across business units. If there's good, strong mobile application ideas, we'll try to build those into a scoping and planning workshop where we can build a prototype and be able to outline the technical and business needs and kind of readiness to be able to get to that point. We do a lot with IT readiness for mobility and helping IT teams either A, build an IT strategy around mobile, or B, assess their progress in some of those IT strategies around mobile. And what really the focus of today's conversation, we do a lot with visualization, and Steve's going to talk about some of those types of components as well. We also do some mobile advisory services. These are kind of structured as block of hour type engagements and allowing your teams, both on the business and IT side, to use our people, our tools, our processes in more of an ad hoc mode, away from really structured, high momentum building workshops. We do a lot of speaking engagements and assisting with vendor evaluations and RFP processes. We help define policy documents. We do a lot of center of excellence creation, as well as sit on a lot of COEs for our clients. And finally, we try to tie this back to delivering managed solutions, where we focus heavily on great user experience, which Steve's going to talk about, as well as application simplicity upfront and trying to build quality, reusable, and portable code on the back end. We perform these webinars monthly, and so if it's your first time with us, welcome and glad you could join us. If you go to our website under resources, you can see a previous 20 webinars, over 20 hours of content around enterprise mobile strategy and delivery, as well as download the slides from all of these presentations. One last thing I wanted to talk about is you might have heard, you might have been in a webinar recently where we introduced the Mobile Research Council. Propellers has a partnership with Lopez Research where we provide access to Lopez Research as well as provide services that help enable those mobile strategies. So check us out on the web at www.mobileresearch.com. Now, let's get to the meat. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Steve Brickman. Steve, since joining Propellers team, Steve has helped a wide range of our enterprise clients determine the direction of their mobile apps, including Amway, Family Dollar, and Bright Horizons. Spent the last decade as a creative technologist and lead strategist for his own design company, Got Your Nose, and improving user experience for such companies as Scholastic, Bell, Guinness, and Nintendo. And Steve co-founded Aperion, which you might have heard of, a Boston-based technology startup focused on mobile application development, and served as a lead UI architect and strategist. So Steve, welcome. Maybe you can kick it off and talk about what we're going to do today.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. And thank you, everyone, for coming by. So today, we're going to be looking at 5 considerations for enterprise mobile app user experience. So first, we'll be looking at sort of a little bit of backstory on the state of user interface, user experience in the enterprise, and sort of how it got to be where it is. And then take a look at the impact that consumer applications have had on enterprise UX and sort of how they're sort of leading the front and pushing the envelope when it comes to enterprise. And then we'll look at some of the top 5 user experience considerations that we can use to educate and improve our enterprise mobile apps. And then lastly, I'll be taking some questions at the end. So before I get into it, I just want to define a couple of terms to make sure we're all on the same page. So UI, or user interface, is really the layout and design of content. So anything that's specifically there on the screen, whether it's a button, a tab, a slide, or a form, anything else, the actual elements that a user digests and interacts with, that's all part of the user interface. So user experience is a much broader term that sort of encompasses the interface itself, the buttons and all that, but it also includes sort of less tangible things like, human psychology. How does this make the user feel? How are they confused? Are they does this feel intuitive to the user? So those sort of elements, and then also additional elements that are sort of more nebulous, like animation, screen transitions, so transition from screen to screen, alerts, any kind of brand identity, things like that, the tone of the language, the voice, all those things sort of add up to equal user experience. So when we talk about enterprise user experience, it's really lagging behind consumer state of user experience. And this is because consumer apps have about a 5-year head start over enterprise counterparts. The idea of a company hiring a person or a team devoted solely to UI design and user experience is a relatively new thing. And for a long time, enterprises sort of suffered the fate of building applications without using a dedicated team or a dedicated UI UX designer. Thankfully, this is changing. The tide is turning, and here's a nice quotation from the Global State of Enterprise Mobility. In the last decade, the consumerization of IT has had a huge impact on enterprises. Workforces now demand the same technology they have in their personal lives in the workspace and don't understand when this technology cannot be delivered. So UX is no longer an afterthought. Now it's sort of an assumed sort of element of interacting with digital objects. It's assumed that the most intuitive, most comfortable experience is going to be provided. And when it's not provided, it's seen as a real drag. So what's wrong with not hiring UI and UX designers? Well, typically this is what's happened over the last decade or so. You wind up with an application that's built in whatever way is easiest for developers to code, since there's no oversight, in whatever way is fastest for them to code. And often, since they're not linguists or MFAs or anything, you find that these sort of applications contain language that only other developers can understand. So at the bottom, I have just a little example of some previous software that I've worked on. And this is discussed a little more in depth in my my last blog post on Propellers, on the Propellers blog. But you can see here, this is a bit of software that hadn't been touched by a UX designer since it was created about 10 years ago. And the result is just sort of this hodgepodge of pop-up windows upon pop-up windows, and nothing is consistent. You can see there's tabs and buttons at the same time, and the language is awkward. You can see here it's, the name and the description are the same, and then this buttons. It's just extremely awkward sort of interface that they wound up with. So why the great divide between enterprise and consumer apps? Well, a number of reasons, most significant of which I think is money, or at least the perception of some sort of savings. So, but in addition to that, consumer apps, when you think about consumer apps, a great interface is really part of the sell. And any consumer app that doesn't have a great experience, great interface, it's just people aren't going to buy it. And in fact, users will complain about it, and they're going to do so very visibly right on the iTunes App Store. Also, of course, you've got the element of competition. So if your app isn't the best, people simply won't buy it. In contrast with enterprise apps, typically you have developers handling interface design as well as the coding. There's no competition, and poor UI sort of became almost par for the course. And frequently, obfuscation and complexity were actually sort of mistaken for sophistication. So the onus was placed on the user to understand the application. There's no pressure on companies to have to sell an app to its own employees, sort of more of a you get what you get kind of situation. And of course, employees are less likely to complain because, an employee who complains is just seen as sort of a negative against that employee rather than against the software. So getting back to the idea of a money saving, so let's look at some development priorities. Formerly, it was sort of thought that there was a significant cost savings in terms of not hiring a UX team because the time required to build an application is less, and the resources required to build an application is less. But the things that weren't recognized in terms of cost savings are things like employee training. It takes more hours to train employees to use a difficult application than it does to use one that's intuitive. There's a steep learning curve. A sloppy interface will often result in inefficient usage or employees simply forgetting how to use the application. You're going to have increased user frustration, increased help desk calls, and you're going to have more crashes and errors from inappropriate usage, so you're going to get more calls to IT to help with that. So a good user interface is really important. In addition to the affirmation, time, and resources needed to accommodate a confusing interface, an intuitive user experience will increase your employees' desire to actually use the application, and it will make their job more fun. So consider the case of airport employees who often still have those, monochromatic green monitors, really old computers and dot matrix printers and that kind of thing. They never seem very happy when I buy my tickets. So in fact, according to one recent Intel study, old PCs cost employees more than a week of work annually. And of course, old PCs are using outdated interfaces. So the same is true for old interfaces. So what's changed? Why is it more important than ever to hire UX designers? Well, when we're talking about mobile, the playing field has literally narrowed. We're talking about a smaller screen, We're talking about more data needing to be organized on those screens. There's no input device other than the user's finger. And we're talking about very device-specific interactivity, accelerometer, multi-touch, those kinds of things, the camera. And we're also talking about a playing field that's widened in mobile because now we're looking at multiple OSs, multiple devices, multiple formats. So things need to be designed for each platform to accommodate screen sizes, pixel densities, and so forth. So enterprise can really no longer afford to treat UX as a lesser priority, particularly given HTML5 and responsive design. It's really imperative that companies hire designers who specifically understand the demands particular to the mobile environment, because mobile really does speak a language all its own. So what are some other differences between enterprise and consumer apps in terms of interface? Well, of course, the end users for both app types are the same. We're just talking about regular people. But the difference is that with enterprise interfaces, they're typically less graphic heavy, and instead they revolve around the organization and display of information. So with enterprise apps, we're not trying to impress the user with any kind of radical new interface like a rotating spherical 3D navigation or anything like that. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Instead, we just want to build an application that's immediately usable and requires no training or in-app instruction whatsoever. All right, with that, let's get into our top 5 UI UX lessons for enterprise apps from the world of consumer apps. Number 1, keep it simple. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but it's really difficult to keep an app simple. Enterprise apps, especially with enterprise apps, because typically they contain far more data than consumer apps. So we don't want to get too clever or fancy. We want to use a real familiar approach to our UX design. The biggest challenge is data organization. The number 1 priority for enterprise apps is comprehension and ease of use, not titillation. So here's a couple of examples here. On the right corner, we have a proposed Windows 8 user interface that clearly didn't make it. This involved some floating bubbles that would actually sort of hover around the screen, and the user was expected to interact with these moving bubbles. So that's the kind of interface we want to. In fact, according to a recent Harvard study, the more visually complex a website is, the lower its visual appeal. So we can assume that that's also true when it comes to mobile apps, that the more visually complex, the less appealing they are visually. So let's look at some examples from Apple's iOS. I feel like Apple's iOS 7 is really represents a sea change in the way we think about mobile interactions. So what I want to do is I learn really well by example. So I just wanted to take you through some specific examples of how the OS has changed from 6 to 7 to sort of help you along. First of all, this is the native weather app. You probably remember it. And it already looks pretty dated, I bet. So if we look at it really closely, we can see things that sort of seem strange to us now. All of this chrome, this sort of gradient, all that sort of the 3D effect. It's really dark. It's just not very attractive. There's all this wasted space with nothing happening in it. There's also sort of wasted information in terms of text here. Local weather, we know that if it just has a town, we know our town. We don't really need that. And also it required interaction to view an hourly forecast over here. It's pretty significant. So now if we look at weather in iOS 7, it immediately feels lighter. It feels more open. There's much more space, much more white space. It uses the entire screen. There's no Chrome anymore. Obvious cues have been removed. This is the level of granularity that Apple has redesigned this OS. It's pretty amazing. If you go back a screen here, they removed the update. All this space taken up by the update information has been removed, and Apple instead is sort of using the animation, this background, these clouds actually move, as a way to suggest that the app has loaded. So I think that's really awesome, the way they're able to use animation in a way to convey information as well as to create something that's aesthetically beautiful. So there's more emphasis placed on text cues, partly cloudy. The iOS 6, there's no indication of what the current weather is. They've also pulled this hourly forecast into a horizontally sliding panel here that's usable at all times, and no interactions required to do that. So you'll notice that there's energy and movement created through the animation, and they're allowing the weather itself to dictate of the screen. It's really great. So the medium really is the message. Content equals design. This is an iOS 7 thing I just want to point out real quick. They've integrated the status bar into the design, whereas before it was just separate. So that helps to unify the entire screen. And also the font is now Helvetica new, Apple's sort of standard iOS 7 font. So looking at them side by side real quick, you can see just major changes overall. So our approach is that negative space equals a positive user experience. So this is a wireframe that I put together for a recent client and handed it over to our designer, who quickly corrected my mistakes for iOS 7. This photo, he enlarged that to go full width of the screen, because the photo in this case is really the most important element. This app was all about helping employees find conference rooms immediately and book them and things like that. And so having as large an image as possible was key. Additionally, he allowed for all this white space down here, as opposed to my idea to group everything together to create a much cleaner interface. So tip number 2, keep it familiar and consistent. What does this mean? Well, it means stick to the established conventions and leverage the standards that already exist. So remember, Apple and Google and Windows have really done a lot of our work for us by creating a rich, intuitive interface language. They've trained us all on how to operate in a mobile environment. So without knowing it, we've all sort of been trained in this new platform. And here I just provide all the links. So to download the various human interface guidelines for each device. So here's Apple, Android, BlackBerry, and Windows. And I strongly recommend you go and download these, even if you're not necessarily designing for that device, just to see all the differences, because there really are a lot. And remember, Apple very explicitly tells us don't use system-defined buttons and icons to mean something else. So not only will doing so result in a more confusing application, but if you're trying to get it on the App Store, it may actually result in it getting rejected by Apple. So I included this just to show you how granular Apple's approach to this new OS was. So every element has really been redesigned. And every element has a name and a very specific function. If you thought that things were just sort of more haphazard than that, they're not. So a check mark needs to look like this. A disclosure indicator needs to look like this. That's sort of a more info button. A detailed disclosure button, which is the difference between the two is sort of It's sort of esoteric, but you need to know it. And then tools like row reordering, row insert, delete button. And notice that we've gone with more flat design. There's no more beveling and things like that. And the delete button now fills the entire table cell. Here are table cells, just to show you how these have changed. They're now the full width of the screen. And notice there's no chrome, everything's flat. There's none of this sort of design in the background. Apple now assumes that we know what these sliders do, so there's no labeling going on there. Buttons have gone the same way. Beveling is all gone. They're wider now, using up more screen space. There's no problem with stacking them immediately, one on top of the other. So really the key is to save space, conserve real estate on the screen. Here's one tip. Avoid the unconventional. This is one example where not going with the traditional language sort of hurt us or was just not acceptable to the client. Our designer had this idea to go with a horizontal indicator for the length of a meeting, and that was really deemed very confusing as it didn't have the visual appearance of going from a time to another time. And so the client ultimately had us integrate this appointment scheduling with the native iOS calendar to give users the most familiar experience. Here's a surprising example of an unconventional, confusing thing from eBay. I don't know if you've experienced this, but this is on the product view screen. And it's simply that they placed the done button down here. And now, you know, I've spent a lot of time putting this together, so I've been to eBay a lot, and every time I go there, even though I know that it's down here because I put the slide together, I still go up here and for the done button. And that just goes to show you how deeply these sort of conventions become locked in our brains once we start using them. So what we recommend, speak the language. Here's one example where we use established paradigms to help this mobile interface seem more familiar, friendly, and easy to understand. So all these icons are taken right out of the human interface guideline. This the slider icon, same thing. Here's a share button. So there's no shame in using established paradigms when it comes to buttons and icons. Okay, tip 3, treat objects like objects. What does that mean? Well, just because we're moving away from this, it's called skeuomorphism, when digital objects are made to resemble real objects, like this picker wheel here, doesn't mean that it's not, we shouldn't treat it like a digital object. So here's the new picker wheel on the right, and it's still, if you've used this picker wheel, it's amazing in terms of how much it still feels like an object, like a big spool that's spinning. But notice, instead of using, you know, gradients and lines and things like that to make it look like it's sort of made out of metal or whatever, it's all done with font sizes, font colors, and the angle of the fonts to create this illusion of realism. So we've simply become more sophisticated about the way that we execute this design. Here's an example where in iOS 6, when you went to swipe to delete an email, the delete button would pop up like that. And this is just to show you how careful Apple was in this redesign. Now, when you swipe to delete an email, the table cell actually slides over as if these buttons were sort of sitting over here the whole time, and now you're just swiping and you're revealing them. So really treating the table cell as an object. Notice these buttons are now bigger. They take up the full height of the table cell as well. So here's side by side, iOS 6 and iOS 7. You can see that 7 is just brighter. There's, again, much more space and more breathing room for the eye. It's more attractive overall. So you've all seen this. This is a new paradigm where the page gets treated, the screen gets treated like an object. When you pull down and then you release, it refreshes the content. So Facebook chooses to provide a little text queue, but eBay and this is the old email queue and then the new email queue, they both use just a simple spinning wheel because now we've all become so accustomed by this paradigm, we all know how it works. Here's a sort of a strange example from YouTube where they've actually chosen to treat the entire screen like an object. You can take a screen and you can begin pulling it down, and as you pull it down, it shrinks until the video is down in the corner. Now, I'm not sure why they did this, except it allows users to sort of watch a video while surfing for other videos. I'm thinking it probably has something to do with ad revenue, but I'm really not sure. Here's CNN, similar thing. And this is when we talk about keeping the interaction consistent. This is a great example. Formerly, they had users swipe right to left when going from section to section. But over here, this is article to article. Users would swipe up and down. So pull for previous article and pull for next article down here. So they changed that. So now it's consistent whether you're swiping section to section or article to article. It's all right to left. So here's an approach that we took to a very complicated set of calculations that we were able to solve with 2 rotating dials. So these rotating dials actually elegantly replace several Excel spreadsheets of data. And you'll notice it's immediately intuitive. Right away, you know that these are meant to be moved around. And one tip here is to use graphic elements in lieu of Chrome or images to create visual interest. So another tip is whenever possible, you should use direct interactions over buttons. So instead of having like an up button and a down button here, the user is interacting directly with this object right here and moving it around in a much more fun way. Okay, number 4, push interactivity forward. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, here's an example in how Apple pushed some interactivity forward in the email from iOS 6 to iOS 7. So formerly, the user had to drill down to the actual email to get to some of these functions, reply, forward, print, and cancel. But now the user simply has to swipe the table cell that's one screen a level up to get to these features. They added the More button right here, and that they've also provided additional features. So they not only moved the functionality forward, they actually added to the functionality in addition. Here's another example. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Control Center in iOS 7. Just a great example of how Apple's pushing more interactivity forward. We finally got a Bluetooth button that's, accessible with one swipe. That was always frustrating. The brightness, same thing. AirPlay is another one. So just making the app more convenient to use, making the device more convenient to use. Here's another example. Remember search in iOS 6? You had to swipe one screen before the home screen to get to it, and that was the only place that it appeared. And now it appears on every screen from the springboard by simply swiping down slightly, it pops up, and the user can search on anything from anywhere on the device. Here's the calendar, and here we see that the user has to tap this button next and forward to go forward and back. And in iOS 7, now the user is interacting directly with the content. So that's an important one that is sort of implied. Always think about how the user can interact directly with the content rather than sort of creating a secondary button to do so. Now we've got the year view, we've got the list view, which seemed to have disappeared for a while, but now it's back. And some of the navigation down here that was sort of confusing in iOS 6, this sort of mysterious icon, has been replaced by more obvious cues there. This is just side by side to show you how this is using the entire screen, so it feels there's much more white space, feels more open and airy. eBay did the same thing. They pulled some interactivity forward. Instead of having to drill down into browse categories, now they provide last viewed items right here in a horizontally scrolling menu to make it easier for the user to get to that content. So here's the Propellers approach. This required a little bit of ideation to learn that this is an inventory count app. So through some ideation, we learned that the quickest way that employees were able to get this information into the app was through the SKU number. So we brought that up to the very top, made that the most prominent element, and included a SKU scanner right here. So this activates the camera, and so making it just even that much easier to get that information into the app as quickly as possible. Once the SKU is scanned, that data appears right here immediately at the top of the list, where the user is immediately assured that the data had been entered successfully. So 5, create space. There's a few ways that you can now create space in your mobile app. So here's an example of, it's not a great app, but they do this pretty well. This is an app called Myrtle. And what they do is, as the user is scrolling, you've probably seen this, certain navigational elements will disappear, slide upwards out of the way. And then when the user sort of swipes in the other direction, they come back. And in this case, I liked it because they got rid of everything. So sort of freeing up the entire screen. Here, in the native Safari, they get rid of the tab bar at the bottom. And instead, they choose to scale this down so that the URL is still visible. Here's some more examples of SlideIn Navigation, where you can dramatically increase the amount of space available to you by creating these panels. And the one thing to remember about these side panels is that you should always include a button there to also activate the panel to indicate that that's there at all. This is just to show you how Facebook has evolved over time, because this kind of these redesigns don't happen overnight. Here's a left-hand panel, and then they went with a right hand and a left-hand panel. And then they got rid of the left-hand panel, replaced it with a search. And then notice in the latest iteration, they've got rid of the search button and simply replaced it with a search bar. So they're pushing that UI forward again as well. They've gotten rid of the title up here, and they're just relying on that icon, the lit up icon in the tab bar to do that work. Also notice as the user scrolls, this top bar goes away, freeing up space there. So Propellers, here's a couple of Propellers examples of how we've done that. These are sort of downward expanding panels, 2 different styles of downward expanding panels, another way to create space, and also to sort of organize content, so the user knows that this content is subordinate to this content. This content is visible all the time, and this content, being less important, needs to be expanded to be visible. Here's another example of how you can create space by sliding table cells horizontally. Whenever you have tools that you want to apply to a table cell or data on a table cell, this is a great way to do it, because it's immediately apparent that these tools relate to this data right here. And here we have what I call taming a complex UI. In this case, we have horizontally sliding table cells. We have vertically expanding table cells, and we also have sliding panels. So using all three of these elements, you create almost unlimited real estate without overwhelming the user by displaying everything all at once. And here is a bonus, number 6, that I think is equally important, but we went with 5 for the title because it's more of a graphic. So this is called grounding the user. I think it's really important. Use sticky headers whenever possible to help ground the user. So in other words, this content here scrolls underneath this header, and that header sticks there until this header meets up with it, and then it pushes it off. Facebook does the same thing here to help ground the user that way. That way the user always knows where they are. This might seem obvious, but it's really important to also ground the user with the use of labels. So this is iOS 6, and I can't believe that it was ever even designed this way. This label is so tiny, and it's separate from the main navigation, which is this tab bar here, or a tab element. So in the redesign, that was all grouped together here and made much more apparent where the user is at, what section. They've done the same thing at the article level, providing a label here instead of down here when the arrow is up here, and also providing a little more information about what story number they're on and how many stories are left total. So lastly, I just want to say when it comes to cross-platform design, there is no easy approach. Designing for multiple devices is difficult and extremely labor-intensive, and it requires a careful screen-to-screen approach. So here we have iOS, Android, and mobile web, and this is just to show you, this is one of our recent clients, and this is just the sign-in screen. So I thought this was a great example because it shows you how the keypad is different for each device and how the size of that is going to affect the device, and also how the keypad interacts. On BlackBerry, the keypad actually pushes content up rather than simply appearing over the content. So additional problems there. So to summarize, 1, keep it simple, keep it familiar and consistent, treat objects like objects, push interactivity forward, create space, and ground the user. So that's it. I hope that's been helpful for everyone. And Eric, would you like to take over?
I would, yeah. And thanks, Steve. When we talk about this with our clients, and as we get into some of these types of these use cases and starting to think about how we take complex corporate data and complex corporate processes and try to define mobile interfaces on top of that, that's obviously a challenge. And the other challenge is we try to instill these types of best practices and work in our clients as well. And we want to be able to see teams as they grow. And so this change and thinking more about Enterprise User X and thinking a little bit more about how this comes about does not happen overnight. And so what we've seen to be successful with other clients is to be able to begin with a single application, try to define really a nexus application, if you will, something that can be developed either through a center of excellence or with an external or internal designer, and be able to use that to set the tone for user experience in the enterprise. Begin to define some of the common navigation you think is going to work well with your users. Begin to find some of the standard elements of design. And we use a lot of things such as style sheets and things like that to start developing some of the standard UX for that. Define when we want to be able to use panels and when we do not. Define how we want to be able to force a refresh. Define how we want to use some of these tips that Steve was talking about in terms of doing slide overs and things like that. One application, that's extremely easy. 20 applications, it becomes extremely challenging. And so, and also kind of with that is we found that different UX works differently for obviously different types of organizations. Everything from the typical type of end user and how they use their current phone, what types of devices that they use, how used are they to a little bit more intuitive UX in other enterprise applications. We work with some organizations that have some really decent UX that is used on their internal website. They drive a lot through that. So that transition was very easy to build those areas. We work with other groups that, not to bad mouth SharePoint, but are using 100% SharePoint. They're used to taking a lot of different steps to get at data. Found it very difficult actually to start using a little bit more easier to use interfaces. Find ways to measure success and then iterate on top of that. You're not going to define these things from the get-go as being the end-all be-all way to be able to develop user experience for your organization. Capture those best practices, find things that work, build those style sheets, define that navigation and how you want to do it, define that for the company, capture those in some way so other teams can use that, whether those teams are in different business units within the organization, something you can send to outside development partners to say, here's how we do UX at my company, and begin to develop that competency in-house. And like I said, it's not something that occurs overnight. It does take time to be able to do those types of things. And from our perspective, I just want to say how we do that is you can see here in how we start conceptualizing and planning for mobile applications. If you've been on other webinars before, this is a process that we do to work with organizations as they start thinking about an area of applications and how do I turn that into a really an app roadmap. But you see we pull this structure very far up front in terms of that prototype creation. That prototype creation includes a lot of this UX work. It starts to define those navigation type hints and how we want to be able to use those graphic assets. And so we're doing that and we're thinking about that even before we even think about what that application roadmap and scope looks like, before we have a technical approach, and far before we're in the middle of figuring out how long and how much and where it's going. And so we pull that structure very far forward within there. And so I encourage you guys to do that as well. That UX, we've even made UX as a key way to determine what the app roadmap entails. And so if it's something that we are trying to understand how to take a very complex set of processes and bring those, or complex set of data and bring those forward into a mobile application, UX might be the way that you guys do some scoping to say, here's where we should start and here's how we add on to that over time. Before we get into questions, just a quick offer. We do a lot of calls with organizations just to help figure out where they are and what we've seen elsewhere and try to see if there's A, services that we can help with, or B, things that we know about the industry to help kind of guide people. That last process I went through is our mobile app scoping and planning Kickstart. It's up on our website. As a special offer, we'll send out an email after this webinar, both with the slides and a link to the recording if you want to download the slides, and have the ability to obviously schedule a one-hour call with Steve, with myself, with anybody within Propellers across a whole variety of topics to be able to do that. So, Stephen, we have a couple questions.
Great.
The first one is we spent some time talking about native applications and a little bit around cross-native applications. What about the mobile web? And what is difference from a UX perspective for mobile web versus these native applications we talked about today?
Well, I happen to have a slide here that I kept just in the event of such a question. So there are some serious differences when you're designing for mobile web and some additional considerations. In this example, so here's Facebook. And well, one thing is you have to be sure that your interactions don't interfere with the interactions that are already available natively. So, and a lot of times those can come as a surprise, and they can sort of come out of nowhere. For instance, in iOS 7, in Safari, when you swipe to the right, which is something that in an app, you would swipe to the right maybe to reveal a panel like this. You swipe to the right in Safari to go back to the previous screen. So you have to be aware of these possible interactions conflicting with each other. So what Facebook does is they provided a button here to take care of that interaction. Another thing they do is on the web, they have a sort button here that triggers a pop-up window that instead of sorting dynamically as they do in the app. And then here's in terms of tapping newsfeed in the app, here's the app example of how it reveals the sort. So I would say that the most significant issue when designing for mobile web, obviously you have to think about features that are not available to you as well that are available when it comes to building a native app, accelerometer and things like that. So and also gestures that will conflict with the OS of whatever device you're designing for.
Steve, do you think it's necessary to, how well does that mobile app functionality, knowing the limitations, how well does it actually need to line up to the native? Is there expectation that it needs to interact the same way, or should that expectation be set?
Yeah, I think maintaining as much consistency as possible is really important. You know, it's all in terms of, I mean, it's a little different in the enterprise space, but in terms of consumer apps, it sort of speaks at the same level of brand identity to make sure that it's consistent, that your interactions are consistent throughout. But I think the same can certainly be said about enterprise apps, just in terms of a user who goes from one type of app to the other. So a person who goes from using the actual native app to a mobile web is going to have a better experience if the same or similar interaction is there.
Steve, thank you. Larry asked, do you have any links or any recommendations for the best reference or training resources for maybe ramping up and cross-training web designers to think more in terms of mobile? I think we've seen this as well, as typically organizations, when they think about mobile UX, the first group they kind of go to is either an external marketing UX team or maybe even an internal UX team that's more built around mobile, around just websites. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the most, the easiest source that you're going to find is what I mentioned really early on, which are just the sort of human interface guidelines that are put out by, you know, Apple, by Google, etc. themselves, because that's going to have the most granular level of detail, and that's going to have the most up-to-date information there. But other than that, just a quick Google search for, you know, any interactive element that you're looking for will reveal, you know, it'll return copious results. And there are some really great blogs out there that deal with interface design, and they're really easy to find. So.
Comes from Dave. He asks, how do you measure what works in user experience design and what does not?
Well, I think, you know, outside of doing actual user testing, which will obviously provide the most accurate read for where your app is maybe lacking or where it's doing well. Outside of that, I would say just going with the established paradigms. As I said, things that are established in the human interface guidelines for Apple, for instance, or just going with what people are familiar with and what they already know will help assure that the app will be immediately intuitive.
The question is from Andy. Last question, it's similar to some of the structure around kind of repurposing user experience teams internally and externally. Should the marketing team have ownership for internal user interfaces, or really should internal development teams or teams that are building applications for the enterprise, should they have their own user experience people? Are those skill sets the same, or are they very different?
I think they are very different. I think a marketing group is used to thinking about things in terms of brand and brand identity, and I think that can often conflict with usability, even where sort of it doesn't intend to, but it just happens to do so, because often the marketing team won't necessarily be thinking about the most usable method to design something simply because they're just not aware of it. So absolutely, I would say that a mobile UX design team is essential.
All right. Well, it's almost 2 o'clock. Steve, thanks for your content and for a great webinar today. To everyone else on the call, as I mentioned before, the recording for this webinar, if you want to go back and repeat a portion of that, as well as the slides, will be available on our website at propellers.com a little bit later today. And we'll also do a follow-up email with a link to that to download it when it is available. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Until next time, we'll be back next month with another webinar. And if you can't get enough, in the meantime, there's 20 hours of recordings and other items available on our website at propellers.com. Have a great day, and we'll see you at our next event.
Thanks, everyone.